So, it has been 10 years since the nascence of the blockchain technology, and its mass adoption is still to come. One of the primary reasons why businesses refuse to implement blockchain-based solutions is that they're not ready to entrust their business processes to the software algorithms, as these basically cannot capture all the possible business cases. Simply put, firms need an instrument to resolve disputes if the code doesn't work as intended. EOS tackles this issue with its on-chain governance system. However, it relies heavily on the block producers. So today we're going to discuss the role, liabilities, and responsibilities of block producers in EOS on-chain governance system. And we have 5 wonderful panelists. Please introduce yourself.
My name is Steve Floyd, CSO of EOS Tribe.
Jetse Sprey. I'm not a CEO or CTO. I'm a lawyer and I work with EOS Amsterdam.
Kevin Rose, co-founder, head of community, EOS New York.
Moti, I'm the interim administrator of ECAF. So effectively, I deal with the admin and all the structure around ECAF.
Hi, and I'm Sharif Bouktila, co-founder of eosDublin.
Okay, so the first question is, a block producer agreement is probably the only document that attempts to outline responsibilities of block producer, and the current version of EOS Constitution doesn't mention block producers at all. So, in your opinion, what are the responsibilities of block producers?
I can start. So I might have a little bit different view. This is DPoS. It's a great thing about about delegated proof of stake systems. We can all have different ideas, share on that. I believe that it should be opt-in. There should be base layer arbitration, and that more or less that block producers' role should be help to facilitate policy, but not necessarily try to heavily influence or shape it alone. And that's kind of where we stand on that.
Yeah, well, as you might know or not, I wrote a charter. That's a charter that says that in my ideal ecosystem, the BPs would dare to be the executing party between or inside the boundaries that a charter would give them. So you have like a base document, that's the charter, or like the base agreement, whatever you call it. And then the details and the executive work would be for the block producers to come in and realize that.
So it's great that a definition of, not definition of a block producer, but their role and responsibilities is such a deeply personal thing in EOS. But at the bottom, at the foundation of it, it is to produce blocks, and it is to provide the infrastructure and maintain the infrastructure to have the platform upon which people can build. Now, after that, because there is this mechanism of continuous campaigning and complete and total lack of job security, we have to take rewards that we receive and reallocate them in a network for value-add things. And it could be through thought leadership of governance. It could be through developer tooling. But I think that beyond just defining a block producer as a producer of blocks, their role is to be accountable, is to be an accountable entity to the health of the ecosystem. And how you define that accountability is not done through consensus of 15 out of 21, but done through feedback through the community. And thus far, it's been very difficult to obtain that feedback. And we're on the edge of being able to do that, hopefully with either polling or binding referendum with token holders.
Yeah, so from my perspective, I think when we're talking about a governed blockchain, there are 3 main parties that lead up to building a governed blockchain. One is the community. One is, effectively the judiciary, or people who resolve disputes. The third are the block producers. So they all have a part to play, and I think they all have an equally important part to play. So following what the others have said, I think block producers, to my mind, have an important part as a check and a balance, perhaps, to the other 2 heads of of power in a governed blockchain. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm not entirely sure how to take this one. In my mind, on EOS, all of the power rests with the block producers, right? 15 to 21 are the only way we can get decisions made. I'm definitely not of the school of thought that block producers should just produce blocks. I think that we need more leadership with block producers to propose ideas, to take ownership, to push the agenda, and to make things, to move things along. I think that there's too much emphasis on, what does token holders want, and the mechanism to get that feedback is only through votes. And in my mind, block producers need to take more responsibility, more accountability for setting the agenda and pushing things forward.
So being responsible and accountable, as well as execution, are like the main roles and directions that block producers should work on, right? Okay. There are plenty of block producers standby and active, and they might have different visions how to do that. So do we need a single document that would outline at least the guidelines for block producers on how to be accountable and on how to execute the orders of either community or ECAF?
I mean, I definitely think our biggest problem right now is the current constitution doesn't have any teeth. It's not enforceable. So until we address that through referendum and we adopt something that has more teeth, we're going to be in this kind of malaise right now of uncertainty. And the solution to that is, part of what I said and part of what Sharif said is, get better token holder feedback through referendum, but also help facilitate. I don't think you necessarily need to push an agenda. I think that's kind of a middle. That's just my opinion, though.
Yeah, well, I think that it should be clear what each of the block producers, whether standby or active, obligations are, and what's totally lacking in the current constitution is a way of determining those. So it's, in my view, what I've proposed is that the block producers themselves should come up with an agreement, and then if the voters don't like it, they vote them out. That's basically what I come up with. But I'm open for other suggestions because it's pretty difficult to rule about your own obligations. But somewhere, and if it's one document or if it's a rule set, or probably like it is now, it's just coded. A lot of what the block producers do is in the code. That it doesn't matter to me. And I'm a lawyer, so I'm supposed to know a little about that sort of thing. Yeah.
So the Constitution being unenforceable, depending on the context, I think that can be a good thing. What actually needs to be enforced? Rather, would it not benefit the community to start to outline the roles and responsibilities, delineate between what's under the purview of token holder referendum and what's under block producer consensus? Rather than trying to create a framework, a punitive framework to say, and focus especially on the fact that if you do this thing, we are able to punish you. I don't know if that's the proper way we should take. I think that if we are to have a unifying document that we agree to ratify in some mechanical way, like referendum, that it should set expectations, especially for newcomers, so that then when they come in, they have something to read and go, oh, I understand the players in this ecosystem and what they are expected to do. Because at the end of the day, the most powerful feedback loop is votes, even though it's very difficult to ascertain why they happen sometimes. So the beautiful thing about EOS is that it enables pockets of like-minded individuals to create their own sets of rules, to create a DAC or a DAC-like structure, which EOS DAC would love to tell you more about. But I think it's setting the stage. What are the expectations of the members in this ecosystem without creating a punitive framework, and then giving the tools and framework to individuals to figure out their own communities within this larger structure.
Yeah, so I suppose to me we need less documents rather than more documents, right? The current constitution is unreadable to most people. We are running a global network, you know, multilingual, people all around the world are joining, and we've got a constitution which takes 5 mobile screens in order to scroll to read it in English. It's nonsense. So to me, what we need to do is strip back what we've got to what is actually important. In terms of a block producer agreement, I think there needs to be an SLA for block producers to the community to say, you know, what they will do in terms of performance, in terms of operations. I think we're 6 months in now. We should have enough learning within this room to understand what that SLA needs to be and what that commitment needs to be. But more documents and more debates is not what we need.
I do agree, though. What we try to do, as Moti put it quite eloquently, is try to find a system that consists of checks and balances to keep this, our blockchain, to be overrun by other people on the cost of, again, other people. We want to serve the community with the blockchain as well, and ourselves as well. And checks and balances are not something that can be done in like 3 words. So, though I do agree, I don't feel the particular need for a lot of documentation. You know, I believe in a working together by the block producers. The more I have been in this community, the more I feel like we kind of become a family, sort of, and there's a joint and deeply felt responsibility. So I would suggest we work from there and find the SLA requirements, as you put it, together and get it going. But if the very foundation of that is the way we want to rule and to govern this chain, and that's not an easy thing to write down, and it's not going to be like written down in just 3 articles. I'm sorry about that, Sheriff.
No, but I mean, to me, govern is the wrong word, right? It's how we operate this chain. You know, govern, it just gives the wrong kind of connotations. You know, we're trying to enable adoption here. We're trying to enable innovation. And words like government and constitution and govern, it just sets the wrong tone.
I completely agree. I think that language is, you know, a huge part of, you have traditional people from crypto coming into the space, and some of the language that we're using it turned a lot of people off. You know what I mean? And I know that it's our jobs as a community to find better integration points and work, you know, with the system to some extent, but bring them to the middle at the table, you know, to have a seat at the table of those negotiations rather than, you know, trying to, you know, subvert it.
So I'm not a block producer, so obviously, but I just want to say that from my perspective, I think there are things that perhaps BPs must do, and those are things that perhaps need to be enforceable. There are things that BPs should do. Those shouldn't necessarily be enforceable because they're nice to have. And there are things that perhaps, as you know, that are nice to have and that we might want BPs to do, but they perhaps don't fall into their remit. I mean, I think we had a lot of discussion, you know, in the previous panels about the history API, etc. You know, I don't think something like that is enforceable, right? Something it's a service that the BPs want to provide. So I think there needs to be a dialogue where we say what must the BPs do, what should they do, and what's nice for them to do, and then on that hierarchy of, let's say, requirements or expectations, we decide what's enforceable and what's not.
Okay, so if we have more documentation, in most cases we end up with less room for interpretation. If we have less documentation, then there is a necessity for a body that would interpret these documents. So who, in our case, we have only constitution. How do you think, who should interpret it?
I think everybody should interpret it, but I think it is important what you just said about about who should interpret it, because entire legal disciplines have been established on interpreting a single document that an entire nation has been founded on for centuries. I was involved in a discussion in Telegram where I asked a question about the interpretation of a particular article of the Constitution, and I was reprimanded for having asked the question. And I said, I'm just trying to understand what the interpretation of this is, because, like I said, people have been doing this for centuries. But I think we need to remember, and it's great that we actually have legal professionals involved, but few and far between. And we're trying to establish a framework that's on the same page, on the same par as these very eloquently drafted documents that have governed nations forever. But it's an entirely different climate. It's an entirely different situation when you are bound within terrestrial borders. And what we have is a completely voluntary, distributed jurisdiction group that has a different culture. In a terrestrial judicial system, there's less so of, if it happens to my neighbor on the other side of the country, that may happen to me. We have to remember that in blockchain, if there is a problem at a protocol level, then people question being a member of that actual network. They question the security of the entire chain, the security of their account. And what we could be doing with these things that we are making decisions on, especially when it comes to making arbitration decisions on property and keys, is that we are calling into question the personal security of every single person's account on chain. That we have to operate within this climate, and that's because we're not going to be able to go back and undo a lot of these things. And I'm not saying we shouldn't do them, but I'm saying that we should take more time to evaluate it, because the framework within which we are operating is suboptimal, would be putting it lightly.
Yeah, I do to a large extent agree on that. The eloquently drafted constitutions have been up to incredibly varying interpretation over the centuries in almost every country. And the least democratic countries have the best written constitutions. At least that's what I learned at law school. I never read them, so I wouldn't really know.
Nobody reads them. This is the thing.
So there's what I think is important is that and I feel that almost every day we work at the EOS Amsterdam, that our future is a moving target. So I would like to have some ground rules defined and focus on a change mechanism that's rather flexible and tries and get as much checks and balances in order to protect minorities and other people. But it should be flexible. I think that's the main thing. And it doesn't. So maybe I kind of agree with Sharif that the core of the document presented, that's where we work from, should be light and simple, so that we can play around with it and adapt it to future use. And we should focus on the way how we want to act, and what we want to do, and how we want to, where it is necessary, make those rules enforceable.
Yeah, so I wrote a blog post a couple of months ago called "Culture Over Constitution," and in my mind the culture's set, right? So we've already froze accounts, we've already changed some keys, and in my mind that's a good thing. We've made decisions based on what the promises were when Block One sold this vision of what this chain was going to be. Account protection and account recovery was in a lot of the talks that I had seen, and a lot of people that came to the community were sold that. So in my mind, block producers and ECAF doing that work is a positive. Could it be improved? Of course it could. I go back to the fact that the culture is set, right? So we now have a way that we do business, and we have to move forward from that. I don't believe more documents is going to move us forward. I think we've got enough smart people in the room and in the community to identify what the challenges are, and then work to make them. Not having a referendum contract was a disaster, launching a chain without a way to make decisions. You know, disaster is the only word that I can have. But you know, we're 6 months live, and I think things are going well overall.
Yeah, I think you know, EOS New York had worked on a user agreement they presented recently, and I think that direction is probably the road we need to go down. Is it what they presented? I don't know. I mean, that's up for discussion. We need to solicit advice from token holders, what they want. We need to get the BP community active and open on what their positions are, and try to bring everybody together and just ask those really tough questions that may not really benefit us. I mean, it may put us out, but we have to find that balance. And it's probably, I lean a little more towards what you said, Sharif, that it's probably going to be less rules overall.
So to me, we need three things, right? We need a user agreement that can be read on a mobile phone screen in multi-languages. We need a developer agreement to set the rules for, you know, smart contracts, etc., Ricardian contracts, and we need a block producer agreement. And with those three things, I think we have enough governance to move on, stop talking about governance and start building some shit.
Okay, so the primary role of EOS governance is actually to help businesses settle down their disputes. As of today, ECAF has issued 19 orders, and all of them had to do with arbitration for stolen funds. We do not see much business involved, and as our ecosystem evolves, probably we would end up with hundreds or with thousands claims regarding stolen funds. So the question is, should the arbitration be limited to fixing errors in the code? If yes, do we need to amend the constitution for that?
Can we? I think we should first separate governance from dispute resolution. We have governance. It's delegated proof of stake. That is the way that we make collective decisions on chain. Validators of the network are voted. The validators vote on how to improve the code. I understand that the white paper is something that we reference, but the white paper is not canon. If we were following exactly what the white paper said, we would have updated absolutely nothing so far, because we'd be waiting for referendum to vote on updates. And to poll the token holders on very technical updates to the blockchain would be an absolute disaster, because I don't run our servers, and if I did, it would be an absolute disaster. That's the exact same logic there. So what we're talking about is dispute resolution, and dispute resolution as a function of transactional confidence in doing business on a global or enterprise scale, or even a smaller scale, is incredibly good. You know, you talk about transactional confidence in Bitcoin, knowing that my transaction will go through, but sometimes you're worried, like, oh my gosh, that transaction is going to go through. And so the dispute resolution layer is to add that extra level of confidence that if there is a problem, because the world isn't perfect, because people aren't perfect, we can figure it out. The crux of the discussion that we are having within the community is, where does that dispute resolution layer sit? And very literally, it is an arbitration clause. Does that exist in the Constitution, or a document like the Constitution, which we all agree to explicitly or implicitly? Or is it within an agreement between you and me, where we are conducting a very specific type of transaction? I just want to help set the stage of what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, so I think I agree with Kevin there. That dispute resolution is really intended to ease, as you said, Kevin, transactional confidence. And it's intended to take care of the situations where, you know, not only just the code didn't work as intended, but situations which are not covered by the code. So there could be a disagreement between block producers about the responsibilities, as an example, right, which is maybe not covered in the code, but is something that they could bring to dispute resolution. Could be a disagreement around voting. You know, there's a myriad of disagreements that could happen, which are not necessarily limited to the code. Now, you referenced that you know, ECAF's current orders have been related to lost property, and that is true. But if it's really just a byproduct of, let's say, the number of cases that have been brought to ECAF. So I think looking at the last statistics that we have, we have about 35% of our cases are related to lost keys, right? So this is people who have literally lost their keys. They posted them there somewhere, and they deleted the hard drive or something, right? So lost keys. And then 25% are related to stolen keys, right? So where somebody had their keys phished, hacked, or whatever it is, right? So we have 60% of our cases that right now, which are related to disputed property. So statistically speaking, our orders will be primarily related to disputed property at this stage. But that doesn't mean that that's the only type of case that we are looking at. There are other cases that perhaps are not public that we are looking at. Yeah.
Well, I'm not understanding how any case could involve anything other than disputed property, because the only thing to have a dispute over is who has control of property on chain. What are you able to share any of the other 40%?
Yeah, so I mean the example I gave, for example, around BP voting or let's say vote buying is another issue. Recently, there's been a case that's been put in around the open sourcing of Ricardian contracts, right? So those are not related to property.
I'll hand it to you in a second. I think that we see a lot of examples in history that the prohibition of certain activities, and I'm not talking about like the crazy, you obviously don't murder people and stuff, but the prohibition, for example, outlawing alcohol or saying that you cannot do some certain activity, these things don't necessarily work out all the time. And I'm not trying to advocate that we should allow vote buying. I'm trying to advocate that we approach this from a slightly different angle, which is create and encourage behaviors that are more attractive to whoever might be the person committing the crime, so to speak, than the crime itself. So when it comes to vote buying, make the resource exchange, REX, more attractive, and make the dividends from that far exceeding what a block producer could do on themselves. So what I want to see us move to is to a constitution that isn't unenforceable, because it doesn't need to be enforced. It is a setting of expectations. And also, just a side comment, I think that once we move past Genesis accounts that can be connected to Ethereum cases, we're going to have a hard time proving ownership of any accounts on EOS without private keys, and doing that in a scalable matter. If 60% of the cases are theft, it's going to be difficult.
So yeah, I mean, I would like to say that, as a dispute resolution body, we don't make the rules around what disputes get put to us, right? That is effectively a byproduct of what the Constitution says. So yeah, so if there's anything, if people are not happy about what kind of disputes ECAF is hearing, well, don't talk to ECAF or don't talk to whatever dispute resolution body. That needs to be changed at the constitutional level.
I agree. I think free market dispute resolution and arbitration forum was the original vision, and that ECAF was kind of an interim solution until that kind of scaled out, and then it became that ECAF was the only arbitration forum. And I think getting to a place where there's just more people involved, you know what I mean? There's more resources, there's more incentives, more money. I just want to take it back to a point that Kevin had made, that aligning the incentives, the incentive model for a large stakeholder to, and we're getting to the root of some of the problems that people have talked about. This is where the contention comes from. People are not following the Reg Producer Agreement, but the Constitution's not enforceable. Well, to some of them who have the stake, they're just running a business. They don't maybe understand all this stuff or care. And I mean, in some ways, should they? If they're using the chain, they should, but I mean, if it's not enforceable, I mean, it's a dividend. So REX, adjusting the incentive model and that kind of stuff would probably be better than trying to make some massive, top-down, punitive, as Kevin said, rules that are probably not going to be followed anyways. So,
yeah, I fully agree on that. I mean, we shouldn't have rules that are not enforceable. We shouldn't be too moralistic about it. But I'm also a bit in doubt if you would move the rules and try and make them better and try to align them better. I think we should do that. But at the end of the day, you will still have bad players, people that don't obliged that need to be corrected. And if there's and I think the question is actually, do we need a system and a dispute resolution system that ensures that the rules we make together, how limited and aligned they are at the end of the day, that they are effectively enforced. I think that's the question. And in my view, you know, that I'm not sure if it should be or continue to be ECAF. You know, I personally I feel like they should have get a better chance, at least more money, and see how it plays out. I understand that in the first version of the constitution with the ICC involved, and you know those could probably easily have done the job. But I think the basic question is, are we going to enforce those rules through arbitration or not? And in my view, if we don't do that, then we have a contract that defines obligations for the parties that have signed it. And if we don't have a dispute resolution system ourselves, that means that every party that has a right or an obligation or thinks somebody else should do something could go to basically a lot of courts and start a huge shitload of lawsuits, which is good for my business, but you know, not for the blockchain.
Yeah. Can I just ask a question to the room? Can you raise your hand if you think that we need dispute resolution on chain? Okay, so a way that if something goes wrong, there is a body that can give an opinion to block producers that block producers can trust in order to make a change on chain.
What are the parameters of what could go wrong? I think that's at the core of the problem. So right now the parameters are very wide. So
It's extremely broad.
what you're asking,
Yeah.
because I'm not going to raise my hand.
Well,
I think a lot of people in the room are not going to raise their hand depending on how you define that question.
okay, that's a good point.
So
A dispute resolution framework by itself is important. I think what we're asking is, should block producers get involved? The only if you are not able to solve a dispute yourself, the only thing you can do is have a block producer or 15 out of 21 do it for you. Does anybody in the room raise your hand if you believe that part of the workflow, part of the workflows of being a block producer would be to receive and execute arbitral awards issued on chain? Okay, and not many may have been raising their hand because there is a lot of confusion about how this works. But what I think would be more powerful, because the people that care most about solving a dispute are the people that are in a dispute. So being able to create a set of tools using smart contracts that we already have available to us, and this is, if anyone is aware, SageWise is a company that's looking to develop on EOS to create a suite of smart contract tools and templates that would allow you, completely independent of block producers, to be able to submit yourselves to arbitration in the case of a dispute. It's just, block producers, everyone knows that they're able to essentially affect the blockchain via consensus, and having them be involved in this kind of thing just dirties it in the minds of everyone. And going back to one of the original things that I said, that if there's an indictment on a single account in this multicellular organism that is a blockchain, the security of the protocol, if it's ever called in question, and I understand that this is definitely not the security of the protocol, I don't want to confuse the two, but many times people do. If that were to happen, we may be shooting ourselves in the foot. That we should just, and I'm not even saying we shouldn't do this, but we should be acting extremely cautiously, and we have been cavalier. We were cavalier when we started the chain and decided to freeze accounts. I was there. We were cavalier. We were cavalier when we changed those keys, and you know, EOS New York also signed that, and we did that because we believed that if we hadn't, it would have made us a hypocrite. But we need to slow down. We are not legal professionals, and we are playing with billions of dollars.
So can I just disagree there by saying that block producers are the only way to enforce things on chain, right? I don't agree with that. I think if you look at the process of how disputes are resolved, if we can look at the real world, typically what happens is two parties, right, would come to a dispute resolution body with their dispute. There will be a ruling made, and that ruling is the first step. So typically the ruling is made, and then the parties then are expected to abide by that ruling, right? Now,
How would you solve 40% of your cases if not having block
no,
producers
but
involved?
we're looking at the long run, right? Where we're not only just looking at lost property, we're looking at DApp layer disputes, etc., right? Where they, block producers are not the primary way of resolving those disputes. The parties would then be expected to abide by that ruling. If they didn't abide by that ruling, there are other measures that are possible. For example, publishing the ruling, making sure that people know that actor A is a bad actor, right, which could have a reputational effect on them and make it difficult for them to run their business. There are myriad of other measures which block producers are just the last resort. Right?
But if we're talking about solving a dispute between people at if I'm a user versus DApp, okay, I've engaged a DApp, there is possibly a terms of service there. If I am a business person to a business person, there's possibly a contract there. If we're talking about in the long run not arbitrating theft and lost keys, what then is the purpose of having a body like the EOS Car Arbitration Forum be able to effectively influence each member on the network should they so solicit it as a part of the Constitution? Or rather, should it just be available to those who need it, and we can remove a lot of the fear that we have had to deal with, a lot of the misunderstanding?
Right. So, let me sort of be clear from the point of view of how I see things evolving, at least if we stayed with the current Constitution, right? I don't see ECAF as being the only dispute resolution body that will ever exist on EOS. Let's say we stay with the current Constitution. So ECAF is, let's say, the base layer body, right? But there's still, even under the current Constitution, you can still contract other arbitration bodies between your DApp, between business and their users. And so in that context, then ECAF is just the body that looks at disputes that for whatever reason are not picked up by other arbitration bodies or dispute resolution bodies in the DApp to DApp bilateral disputes.
Okay, thank you. We're running out of time, and I want to ask the last question for today. ECAF orders were violated, and this resulted in the loss of more than 60,000 EOS. More than 24 block producers were involved in this, and I want to ask you guys, what do you think about the extent of liabilities that block producers should bear, and how to scale the governance so the disputes are resolved faster and victims get their money faster?
You're basically asking a means to scale this process. I think
means to scale the process and extent of liabilities of block producers.
I can tell you from for the first question, I can tell you from experience with our we tried to do a Valor fund to basically alleviate those early token holders who had their, that first round of people had their accounts frozen. It was a lot of work. It was a lot of research. We had even collaborated with Moti here on how would we do that. And we kind of came to the conclusion, one, we didn't believe that block producers should be collecting public funds. And two, that until the worker proposal system had come online, if it ever does, that might be the best means to fund and have more of a community involvement with this. So certainly there could be like block producers collecting funds to fix things, but when you get into engagement with direct token holder loss, that sets a bad precedent on both sides. You could essentially, one, interpret that as some form of vote buying, and two, then you're getting into tons of liability, potentially if something went wrong. So I think until we have more of the automation that SageWise is working on, and a way to kind of, to scale that up, I think the balance between those two forces is, one, put some type of fund where you can alleviate people immediately the loudest people, the most harmed, the ones that are clearly violated, you know what I mean, that have some way for relief in the short term. And two, I would say that block producers themselves just spending more time and be willing to even put up or make people whole in those really tough cases, to donate if it was their bad. And in other words, if you had caused that loss, it was literally your node that didn't add the blacklist, it might be in good taste to just make them whole out of some of your rewards.
But
does that set a bad precedence, though?
It's a slippery slope, right? So if it's a couple of hundred EOS, then obviously the BP will say, yeah, well, I'll make that whole. But if it's a couple of $1 million, they're
go
not. So
bankrupt.
and we need to have the same process regardless of what the account size is. I think we all have to recognize that the whole blacklist process is broken, right? It just doesn't work. So I don't believe that any one BP should be liable for missing one because the process wasn't right. It wasn't great. I think that the network or the community as a whole should probably pay to make the missed blacklist accounts whole, and then we should never do blacklist again. It should be a once-off thing, and then allow those cases to continue due process with ECAF, and if the accounts are returned to whatever it is. So that's the way I would look at it.
From my perspective, the liability of a block producer is not limited at the moment. It's not in any constitution. It is in our charter, but not in I don't think it's in your agreement. We did limit the liability of a block producer because we figured, it might be a bit of an awkward space to be in because you control the chain, 15 together. If you make a mistake, you're fully liable, even if it's you can't try and make people whole, but that's if it's about real money, you end up belly up. That's a real risk, and that's not something someone that lost that $1 million is going to walk away from and tell all of you, oh, you made a mistake with the blacklist. Well, shit happens, and you end up in court, definitely. So that's why we should really think hard about the block producer liability. And my suggestion is to put into the charter or the agreement or anything, unless let me put it this way: if mistakes are made, this is a especially in tech, things go wrong. I've worked in tech for like decades, and I've never seen software performing as it's supposed to be when it's got delivered. So, there's always stuff that don't work. So you want to limit your liability. I want to have that in each and every constitution you vote for. Please ask to put that in.
Well, with the blacklist liability, I guess pass, because we haven't personally screwed that one up yet. So someone else can answer that one. Our plan is to never screw it up. I hope that we are able. We are such a diverse group. We are such a diverse network, and one of the things that was mentioned earlier was the word constitution. That is a word that you cross an invisible line, draw it on a map, and talk to a new person from a different culture. It's going to mean something entirely different. In the United States, it means something to champion and protect. In other places, it's extremely inflammatory, or in other places, it doesn't have a meaning. I don't know, but we need to. We're trying to sometimes shove really widespread moral platitudes into what is essentially a legal framework, and it needs to be done in a way that obviously we're not enabling evil doing, but we're enabling people to decide for themselves. This still is a network, and I guess I'm doing it right now, which is the moral injection. But this is a network found on voluntary participation, and that if you don't want to be a part of it, you don't have to. You don't get that anywhere else. You can't just decide not to submit yourselves to the laws of any terrestrial jurisdiction, but you can just stop being a part of EOS. I hope that we focus on a technology solution for dispute resolution, because in my opinion, the direction ECAF should be going in is to make themselves, the human element of arbitration, almost irrelevant when compared to the technological tools that are available. I hope that's where we go. When it comes to SageWise, and we didn't even talk about this in the discussion, they're probably not going to build on EOS because they asked for over $1 million, which would come from no one. And that's essentially what the worker proposal fund is for. But we're going to delete that because we're very afraid of it being pilfered. And maybe it would be, I don't know. But we'll be able to make those decisions when we're able to poll token holders through referendum. Hopefully people react and actually participate, which I think will be a big problem up front. But ultimately, at the end, we still are a governed blockchain. We are delegated proof of stake, and we have a way, a clear path forward to make changes at a protocol level in the network. That's the most important thing to businesses, first and foremost, and to users, first and foremost, and I think to all of us, first and foremost.
So I would, regarding the question of liability, I would go back to that framework around what the governed blockchain is: BPs, community, and then judiciary. So I'm heartened to hear that we're having this discussion. I think first off, if you follow that trilogy, the BPs themselves need to have that discussion as to what happens if a BP misses a blacklist. Right? This is part of that discussion. If for whatever reason the people are not happy with the results of that discussion, then the next check is on the community. So the community have the opportunity to vote on a BP vote if they're not happy with how that discussion went. Then the third level is if an individual or the community, perhaps who is feels wronged by by an action, they can always file a claim, right? So still within that framework of the governed blockchain. And then just as a closing thought on to Kevin's point there about say ECAF or base layer dispute resolution. Yes, we do want to see to go to leveraging technology solutions as much as possible, right? To solve all the cases that can be solved with technical tools, input and feedback, and then focus really on the human side. But that doesn't come immediately, right? So we first need to build up a few, let's say, rulings in particular areas, and understand the level of differentiation that cases have. When you have understood that level of differentiation, then you can apply technical solutions to resolving those. Yeah.
I do think the scalability is of course much helped by automated decision making. However, it's under the GDPR, which is the data protection regulation in Europe, it is not allowed. So you will need to have a person look at a case, a human. So so at the end there shall always be a judge, and I can tell you that in probably all countries in the world, people have worked to automate the judicial system for decades, and they have all failed miserably up to now. So I would suggest not to be too optimistic about the automation probabilities of automating the judicial system. With AI these days might go easier,
It's not a judicial system, is it? It's literally called alternative dispute resolution. It's an alternative to the judicial.
Dispute resolution. I mean, to me, a court or an arbitrator is sort of the same thing. I'm sorry about that, but you're right. Of course, we talk about ADR.
Like we have to separate. That's very, very, very different. I mean, a judge as appointed for life is far different, and definitely not something that we want to create. I don't think it's a judiciary. I think it's a dispute resolution process.
Fine.
Okay, thank you for the discussion.